There's a wound most men carry but never name. It's not loud. It doesn't bleed. It shows up in the way you wait too long to speak. In the way you laugh at things you don't find funny. In the way you say it's fine when your soul's already halfway out the door. And she sees it. Maybe not with words, but with instinct. A woman doesn't always know what's missing, but she can feel when a man's center isn't intact. Not because he's cruel, but because he's slowly stepped out of his own frame. You think she missed it. That moment you explained too much. That hesitation in your voice when you tried to sound certain. That one time you agreed just to avoid friction. But she didn't miss it. She felt it like a shift in temperature, subtle drop, a loss of tension. Women don't listen the way men do. They listen. They absorb your posture, your pauses, your hesitations. She doesn't need to know your history to know your alignment is off. She just knows. Something doesn't hold. And here's the haunting part. You didn't even notice you gave it away. Your strength, your edge. It didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It was handed off, gesture by gesture. You softened not from love, but from fear of losing her. You tolerated what once you'd walk away from. And the more you tried to prove you were enough, the less she felt it. Not because you were weak, but because you became uncertain. And a man who doubts himself teaches others to doubt him too. This is the invisible shift, the one she can't articulate, but can't unfeel. It's not your words, it's your energy. It's the moment you stopped embodying who you are and started performing who you think she wants. And in that quiet flicker, she registers it, not consciously, but biologically. Women are drawn to depth, clarity, stillness, not performance, not persuasion. And if you don't reclaim your presence, she won't leave because she doesn't care. She'll leave because you already did, long before she did. There was always something just a little off. You couldn't name it, but you felt it. A delay in her laughter, a glance that used to linger, now passing through you like a breeze that forgot it ever touched you. She was still there, physically, verbally, but the current had shifted. What once felt magnetic now felt muted. You told yourself not to overthink, but some part of you already knew her body was present, but her attention had left the room. At first you tried harder. More attentiveness, more patience, more softness, but none of it landed. Because what was missing wasn't effort, it was alignment. Somewhere along the way your gravity had turned into gravity well, pulling, not anchoring. She felt it, even if she didn't say it. The subtle ache of imbalance, of a man who stopped being still and started trying to be liked. You thought you were deepening connection, but you were feeding a void that only grew hungrier with every word. And this is how it happens. She pulls away slightly, and you lean in without noticing. She gives you less, and you offer more in hopes of restoring what used to flow naturally. You mistake her stillness for confusion, when really it's observation. She's no longer responding, she's measuring. Not your charm, but your center. Is it intact? Is it real? Or has it become a mask of pleasantries and promises crafted to keep her attention? You thought love was in the effort, but she was searching for essence. A stoic man doesn't panic when the air changes. He doesn't chase warmth when the room turns cold. He notices. He adjusts his breath, not his value. Because he knows if the connection fades when he stops bending, it wasn't a connection. It was a performance. You sensed something was off because something was. Not in her behavior, but in your being. And the moment you name it, not with anger, but with clarity, you stop asking for her to return. And start asking yourself where you first disappeared. It doesn't start with something dramatic, no betrayal, no loud exit. Just a slow, barely visible shift in how you show up. You stop teasing like you used to. You pause before saying what you really think. You nod more often than you challenge. Not out of love, but out of calculation. You think you're creating harmony, but what you're actually doing is slowly muting the very tone she was drawn to. It's not rejection that kills attraction. It's self-abandonment wearing the mask of being understanding. That's the pattern, the disguised erosion. You think you're being emotionally mature, flexible, kind, But behind every compromise lies a subtle fear: if I don't adapt, I'll lose her. You start bending once, then twice, then daily, until the man she met becomes a foggy outline. You're still there physically, still kind, still good, but no longer charged, no longer unpredictable. You've traded polarity for permission, and a woman doesn't fall for permission. She falls for presence. It's like overwatering a fire. You're trying so hard to keep it alive that you drown it. You think you're nurturing the connection, but you're flooding the space where tension once lived. That healthy space between two people where contrast could breathe. Now it's gone. She doesn't feel your edges anymore, and without edges, you don't challenge her. You soothe her too much, and soothing without polarity becomes emotional noise. It's calm on the surface, but dead underneath. Ask yourself, quietly, honestly, am I being kind, or am I slowly disappearing in plain sight? Because one of those builds love, the other erases respect. And respect doesn't return just because you're nice. It returns when you reclaim your structure, when you stop playing the role of the safe one and return to being the real one. That's the moment she feels you again, not as the man trying to keep her, but as the man who never needed to vanish to be loved. Silence is not neutral. It carries weight. It either creates tension or collapses it, depending on who holds it. Most men rush to fill it, apologize for it, explain it away. But a stoic man knows silence is not the absence of words, it's the presence of being. It's where clarity lives, where strength is measured. When you speak from emptiness, she hears noise. When you sit in silence from stillness, she feels weight. And weight, when calm and steady, is what makes her lean in without knowing why. Psychologically, silence triggers anticipation. It forces the other person to listen differently, to reach internally rather than be carried by sound. In a world addicted to instant response, silence has become rare and therefore powerful. But here's the distinction: silence out of fear dissolves attraction. It creates confusion, not mystery. Silence out of presence, on the other hand, builds intrigue. It sharpens attention. It tells her, I'm not here to perform. I'm here to witness. A man who uses silence from strength doesn't avoid, he observes. He doesn't withhold to punish, he holds back to stay true. And when she notices his quiet, she's not unsettled because he's cold, she's drawn because he's not leaking energy. He's not explaining himself into approval. He's simply there, unshaken, like a stone in a rushing river, unmoved while the current dances around him. In that stillness he becomes rare, and what is rare becomes unforgettable. You don't need to speak more to be seen. You need to be anchored to be felt. Women don't remember the man who reacted to every emotion. They remember the one who made them slow down without saying a word. The one who didn't chase the silence, but owned it. So ask yourself, not with pride but with precision, is my silence a collapse or a signal? One fades, the other imprints, and the man who knows the difference never needs to raise his voice to be heard. Maybe you didn't fall in love with her. Maybe you fell in love with who you were when she looked at you a certain way. The version of yourself reflected back through her attention, stronger, more important, more whole. But that wasn't her. That was your own hunger, dressed up in her smile. And when the silence came, it wasn't her you missed. It was the temporary version of you, the one you believed in more when she was watching. Real intimacy begins where illusion ends. Most men don't chase women, they chase certainty. They fall for the feeling of being chosen, the sense of mattering in someone else's world. But Stoicism asks, was it true, or just familiar? Did you connect with her essence or with your projection? Because if what you lost can be shattered by a pause, a silence, a shift in her tone, perhaps you weren't holding her, you were holding a mirror and calling it love. She became a canvas. And every gesture, every glance, every pause you painted with meaning. You told yourself stories, that she was deep, complicated, mysterious, but you never truly saw her. You saw what you needed her to be. And when she began to change, it wasn't betrayal. It was reality refusing to support your fiction. You thought she withdrew. But in truth, she simply stopped reflecting back the version of yourself you were clinging to. Epictetus said, "It's not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them." You weren't broken because she changed. You were broken because the story unraveled, because the reflection disappeared, and now clarity arrives, not with anger, but with quiet release. She was never yours to lose, because she was never fully seen. You were in love, yes, but not with her. You were in love with the feeling of being seen by someone. Before you learned to see yourself, it didn't happen in a single moment. There was no dramatic fall, just the quiet decision to send one more message, to ask if she was okay again, to offer more of yourself than what was asked. You told yourself it was care, but something in your body knew. You were no longer showing up as you. You were slowly shifting, trimming, softening your edges, not to love her better, but to avoid the feeling of being left behind. That was the moment you gave yourself away. It's a subtle betrayal, the kind where you're both the thief and the victim. You think you're leaning in with strength, but you're actually negotiating your place. You stop speaking your truth fully. You apologize when you're not wrong. You say yes when you mean maybe. It doesn't come from weakness, but from a deeper wound. If I don't make her feel something, I'll lose her. But the Stoics would ask, if what you give must be edited to be kept, is it still yours at all? And here's the paradox. The more you give in hopes of being chosen, the less of you remains for her to choose. You become available, agreeable, invisible. She doesn't reject you. She just stops feeling you, because you're no longer standing. You're floating in orbit around her mood, her silence, her presence. Attraction dies not in conflict, but in accommodation, and the part of you that once anchored her. It dissolved the moment you needed her to decide your worth. So ask yourself, not as judgment, but as revelation, am I loving her, or trying to prove I'm enough for her? Because the answer is everything. One flows from fullness, the other drips from fear, and the moment you recognize the difference, you return to yourself, slowly, gently, without shame. Like remembering a song you once knew by heart. You don't need to be needed to have value. You don't need to be kept to have gravity. That was the lie, and now it no longer holds. What if she wasn't rejecting you? What if she was just responding to the parts of you that had already left yourself? Her shift wasn't betrayal, it was reflection. You think she pulled away, but maybe she simply mirrored back the quiet way you pulled away from your center. That's the Stoic mirror. It doesn't show you the world. It shows you you, your posture, your desperation, your need dressed as love. And it doesn't judge. It just reflects until you're willing to stop blaming the glass. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. But how often did you give that power away, expecting her to validate your presence, to confirm your worth? You weren't being weak. You were just asleep, caught in the comfort of external clarity. But the Stoic path asks, are you moving through your day, or is your day moving through you? Because when your peace depends on her tone, you are no longer in command of your own life. The truth is harsh but freeing. She was never the storm. She was the weather revealing your foundation. Her silence exposed your noise. Her distance revealed your dependence. Her unpredictability wasn't chaos, it was your invitation to find stillness. That's the power of the mirror. It doesn't argue, it doesn't fix, it shows. And when you finally stop trying to change the reflection, you begin changing the posture that created it. So pause now and ask, not as a victim, but as a witness, am I guiding my emotions or am I ruled by them? Epictetus said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. You saw her pull away, and you made it about you. But what if it wasn't? What if that space was your chance to return to your apsis, to choose silence without collapse, distance without insecurity, presence without performance? That's Stoicism, and it doesn't begin with her, it begins with you. There's a question you never said aloud, but it shaped everything. If I stopped trying, would she still want me? You never asked it. You buried it under effort, under niceness, under strategic silence. But it was always there, humming underneath every word you didn't say, every message you overthought. That question didn't disappear, it drove you. Quietly, subtly, like a current beneath still water. And she felt it, not the words, but the unrest you thought you'd hidden well. Most men don't suffer because they're rejected. They suffer because they avoid asking what needs to be asked. The questions we fear the most are the ones that command us the longest. Am I only loved when I perform? Would she still stay if I stopped bending? These aren't doubts. They're mirrors. And when you refuse to look, they don't vanish. They distort your posture, your tone, your rhythm. You become a man shaped by avoidance. And no woman trusts a man who can't even face himself. You called it being careful, being sensitive, being emotionally aware, but underneath it all, it was fear. Not of her answer, but of the answer you already knew. That's what makes these questions dangerous. They don't need to be spoken to shape you. They just need to stay unanswered. A Stoic doesn't ask for reassurance. He turns inward and asks, is this thought useful? If it's not, he lets it go. But if it lingers, if it whispers, if it repeats, you face it. Not to fix it, but to stop being led by it. So here's the challenge, not to confront her, but to confront you. Sit with the silence, not between you and her, but between you and your own voice. The one that says, don't rock the boat. The one that asks, what if you're not enough? Don't run from that voice, listen. Let it speak fully. Because it's not the silence in the room that breaks you. It's the silence you've made inside yourself. And until you learn to stand in that quiet without trembling, you will never truly be heard. She pulls away, then returns with warmth. She goes quiet after deep connection. She says she's fine, but you feel a wall behind her smile. To the untrained eye, it feels like contradiction. To the reactive man, it feels like a game. But what if it isn't manipulation? What if it's a pattern woven into her biology, her emotional survival system scanning for one thing? Can you hold your frame when she can't hold hers? She's not testing your ego. She's testing your steadiness. From a psychological lens, many women don't play games, they measure safety. Their shifts in tone, their push-pull dynamic, their subtle silence, these are not traps. They are questions without words. Will he chase me if I retreat? Will he collapse if I'm cold? Can he still lead when I'm lost in myself? These aren't conscious strategies. They're emotional radar. And your reaction doesn't just inform her, it defines you. Not in what you say, but in who you become when control slips from your hands. A Stoic man doesn't respond to these moments with panic or performance. He doesn't beg to be understood or fix the emotional weather. He holds. He becomes the container, not the chaos. His presence tells her, you can waver, but I won't. And in that, she relaxes, not because he says the perfect words, but because she senses something rare, a man who doesn't need emotional permission to remain in alignment. His depth isn't shaken by silence. His value doesn't shrink in uncertainty. So before you call it a game, ask yourself, am I being tested or being revealed? She isn't trying to manipulate you. She's trying to feel you, not your logic, your root, not your charm, your core. And the moment you stop reacting and start observing, you enter a different domain of connection. One where attraction isn't a reward for compliance, but a response to grounded clarity. And the man who embodies that, he doesn't need to win her trust. He becomes the place where it lands naturally. Reclaiming the frame doesn't mean controlling her behavior. It means controlling your center. It begins the moment you stop trying to manage her emotions and start mastering your own. When she withdraws, you don't chase. When she tests, you don't flinch, you breathe. You observe. You stay rooted. Because the frame isn't built with dominance. It's built with presence. And presence means you don't abandon your values just to be validated in the moment. There's a distinct difference between a man who reacts and a man who leads. The reactive man needs constant reassurance. He interprets silence as rejection. He bends his truth to keep the peace. But the man who leads, he doesn't raise his voice. He raises his standards. He doesn't need to be understood to stay composed. Marcus Aurelius reminded us the tranquility that comes when you stop caring what they say or do. Only what you do. That's not arrogance. That's internal alignment. So you set the tempo, not with words but with posture, with stillness that doesn't collapse under pressure, with boundaries that don't need explanation. You listen but don't absorb confusion as truth. You feel but you don't bleed all over the floor. The Stoic man doesn't use silence to punish, he uses it to anchor, because he knows you can't control her reactions. You can only control your presence, and that presence is the most attractive force in any room. You don't need to be chosen to feel valid. You don't need to be desired to feel powerful. That's the pivot. When you stop performing for approval and start embodying respect for yourself first, something in the dynamic shifts. Not because you demanded it, but because you embodied it. And in that space, you no longer ask, does she love me enough? Instead, you declare quietly, unwaveringly, this is who I am, and I will only be met where I remain whole. That is the reclaimed frame, and she will feel it whether she stays or not. There's a stillness now. Not because things are resolved, but because you are. The noise has quieted, not outside, but within. You no longer pace your mind, waiting for her to reply, to affirm, to return. You've stepped back into your own presence, not as a defense, but as a remembering. And when you look back to that first moment, her glance, your heartbeat, the silent question beneath it all, you see it clearly now. You weren't pulled in by her, but by the part of you hoping she'd reflect something you hadn't owned yet. That's the shift. Not in the story, but in the lens. You no longer view her withdrawal as betrayal. You don't need to label her signals anymore. The ache is still there, but it's clean now, without story, without blame. Like wind moving through the branches of a tree that no longer bends in panic, but sways with trust. You see that her silence didn't wound you. It revealed where you had stopped listening to yourself. And that clarity, quiet as it is, feels like the most honest thing you've ever known. The need to be understood has fallen away. The desire to be seen has softened. Not because they don't matter, but because they no longer define your footing. You speak less now, not from caution, but from contentment. You realize presence doesn't need explanation. It radiates on its own. Just as the oak does not declare its strength, it simply stands weathered, unmoved, and fully alive. And in that standing, you finally see what you were chasing was never her. It was the calm that only self-trust can give. This is not a victory. It's not a conclusion. It's a return to the self before the chase, to the quiet you once feared. And now, when the next glance lingers, when the next moment tempts you to reach, to bend, to become again what you are not, you'll pause. You'll feel the echo of the man you were at the beginning. And this time you'll stay, not for her, not for outcome, but because clarity once tasted is harder to betray than any fleeting connection could ever be. You began with a glance, a shift so subtle it barely registered, but something in you moved. You felt it in your chest, in your pace, in the way you started reaching before anything was truly lost. And from that moment on, everything became reaction. Her silence, her smile, her pauses. You thought you were reading her, but really you were responding to the space inside you she unknowingly illuminated. Not because she asked for it, but because you handed her the mirror. You shaped yourself, bent slowly, called it care, called it awareness, until one day you couldn't tell where your instincts ended and your performances began. The ache wasn't heartbreak, it was disorientation. You weren't losing her, you were losing you. And the more you tried to fix it through effort, the more invisible you became. But even that was part of the lesson. Because clarity is rarely found in the light. It's found in the moment you realize the light was coming from you all along. And now, from this stillness, you look back, not with regret, but recognition. Every misstep, every compromise, every silent scream for approval, it all pointed to one truth. You don't need to become someone else to be loved. You need to remember who you are so you're never negotiated again. That was the distortion from the start. You believed you had to be chosen to be worthy, but worth was never up for debate. Only your memory of it was. So here we are, full circle. The same silence that once made you panic now feels like home. The same moment that once triggered need now stirs peace. You no longer ask if she sees you. You ask if you're willing to stay seen by yourself. That's the shift. That's the frame. Not reclaimed by force, but remembered by presence. And in that remembering, you don't become someone new. You return to the man who was never meant to be forgotten, only reawakened. So now the question is no longer about her. It's about you. What will you do with the clarity you've earned? Because reflection without response is just a more sophisticated way to stay stuck. And you've seen this loop before, different names, same silence. The part of you that needs to be needed will always lead you back here unless you choose differently. Not loudly, not dramatically, but internally, quietly, decisively. You can walk away and file this as something to think about. That's the easiest path, and the most dangerous, because unclaimed clarity turns into sharper regret the next time you shrink, bend, or silence yourself to be accepted. A Stoic does not beg the moment to be easy. He simply refuses to keep betraying himself in it. And now that you've seen the pattern, you can't pretend not to feel its edges anymore. So here's the invitation. Revisit the ancient words that have already outlived every confusion you've had. Start with Epictetus. Sit with Marcus, not for quotes but for alignment. And if you want to go deeper, there's a room we've built, a place for men like you are done performing and ready to rebuild presence. Not through bravado, but through inner structure. Because you don't become unshakable overnight. You become it through remembering again and again what you'll no longer abandon for love. Or you can repeat. Keep reaching when you feel distance. Keep proving when you feel doubt. But don't say you didn't know better. Don't say you didn't feel it shift. You did, and that feeling you had at the beginning, the invisible shift, that was never about her. That was the moment your soul asked, will you finally stay with me this time? The answer isn't in another video, it's in whether you keep listening or finally act quietly, as only a man in command of himself can. Before you scroll away, pause, not because this is the end, but because it isn't. The real work begins after the words, after the reflection, after the echo of your own patterns becomes too loud to ignore. The Stoic doesn't ask, what should I do next? He asks, can I stay with myself when there is nothing left to chase? So tonight, no journaling, no affirmations, just silence. Sit for 5 minutes with no screen, no sound, just breath and presence, and see what surfaces when you stop performing. If discomfort rises, stay. Don't soothe it, don't label it, let it speak. Because that discomfort, it's not weakness. It's the residue of 1,000 quiet abandonments. You've left yourself many times before. For approval, for safety, for love. But not this time. This time you just stay. Epictetus wrote, no man is free who is not master of himself. That mastery begins in moments like this, mundane, invisible, unglamorous, but defining. You don't need a breakthrough, you need a practice. A daily, quiet refusal to betray what you know. A commitment to feel the tension without leaking into reaction. To hold the pause without filling it with noise. To let your value stand untouched, unproved. Because if she walks away, let it be from your truth. Not from the version of you that tried to earn what was never supposed to cost your essence. So here's your Stoic challenge in the next moment of uncertainty. Do nothing. Don't adjust. Just notice. Let the stillness hold. Let your presence speak. And remember, your value is not in how loud you can declare it, but in how quietly you can carry it. If you can learn to do nothing while staying fully there, then you've already won more than approval. You've remembered your frame, and no one can take that from a man who no longer gives it away. Do you remember that first moment, the invisible shift, the glance you overanalyzed, the silence you filled too quickly, the subtle tension in your chest that you dismissed as curiosity, but was actually your intuition whispering, don't leave yourself. You thought you were falling for her, but now you understand you were falling away from your center, and everything that followed was just the echo of that first quiet departure from self. Now you stand at the same threshold, but with different eyes. The pattern didn't change, you did. Where there was once reaching, there's now recognition. Where there was once noise, there's now stillness. And when the next shift arrives, and it will, you won't chase it. You'll feel it fully, breathe through it and remain, because you've already seen what happens when you leave your post. And you're not willing to pay that cost again. But if this spoke to something deeper, something not yet fully named, then the work is far from over. Because what if the real question isn't about her at all? What if the next step is turning inward, toward the boy you left behind, the one who first decided love must be earned? That story runs deeper than any woman's silence. And in our next conversation, we'll go there, not to heal him quickly, but to finally sit beside him and listen. Until then, hold the stillness. Let the silence settle around you like armor, not absence. And if another shift comes, if another glance stirs something familiar, don't move. Don't interpret. Just observe. Because that tension you used to fear, it's no longer a threat. It's a reminder that you were never meant to chase reflection, but to embody your own light. And that light doesn't blink, it burns quietly, especially in the dark.